Great. So what is CPB and why do we use it? So civil preparation of the battle space, it is a Marine Corps doctrinal process. So it's not a process that you will find in Army civil affairs or U.S. joint civil affairs doctrine. And this process is used to analyze and assess that civil information and the civilian impact on all relevant actors, threats and networks in the operating environment. And it's not just threats and the people that are there, but eventually also those impacts to military forces and our impacts on them. This process is a four-step analytical process that looks at that civil operating environment, and it's there to understand the civil operating environment so that we can then inform, we being the civil affairs professionals, can inform our decision makers of possible civil actions that may impact our military mission, and also make them aware of our military mission's impacts to their civilian environment. Next slide, please. So you might be asking yourself, okay, so civil preparation of the battle space. I know there's an intel preparation of the battle space. So how is this similar? How is this different? So as you can see right here, this circle depicts the 4 steps of the intelligence preparation IPB process, where step 1 is you're defining the operational environment. Step 2, you describe the effects on the environment. And then step 3 is where everything is very specific on the adversary. You evaluate that adversary. And then 4, you determine that adversary course of action. All right, so now let's compare that to the 4 steps of civil preparation of the battle space. Next slide, please. So for the first step, for civil preparation of the battle space, we define the civil operating environment. So from the get-go, from step 1, we focus on that civil operating environment. Not just the operational environment, but specifically the civilians in that operating environment. Next slide, please. Then for step 2, we analyze. This is the heftiest step. This is where most of that work happens. We're going to analyze that civil operating environment. Next slide, please. Step 3, once we've done that analysis, then we're going to be able to develop a civil environment model, which is a specific product that we will look at here in a second. Next slide, please. And then step 4, just like in step 4 of IPB, we determined the adversary courses of action. Here, we're actually going to determine what that civil action is. And it's specifically looking at that civil action with that military force that's in there, based on the analysis that we did. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get right into it. So step 1, we basically already did step 1 in block 1, and that's where we defined that civil operating environment. That's where we're like, you know what? Let's just see what's there. Let's just list what's there. Let's look at the ASCOPE civil considerations, and let's, as much as we can, use those operational variables of PMESII to refine what we see in that civil operating environment so we can define that ASCOPE PMESII. Next slide, please. Then that's where we get into the heavy steps. Step 2. This is where we analyze the civil operating environment. This is the step where we evaluate and analyze everything that we collected in step 1 through ASCOPE PMESII, because we're going to determine we use this step to determine the reliability of information as well as the accuracy of information. We're specifically going to analyze civil factors and relevance, where factors are defined as aspects in that civil environment that will significantly affect friendly forces, both positively and in a negative manner. And then in relevance, we want to know how and why each factor affects friendly forces. We also determine those key influences, and key influences can be anything from selected groups, individuals, assets, infrastructure, social cultural beliefs, or social cultural belief sets of factors, which could have a significant influence on friendly mission accomplishment, and they could also be considered in operational planning and execution. These key influences, they are not just people, they can be places and things as well. Next slide, please. So here we have a visual depiction of what this all is going to look like, where on the left you see the analysis and analysis of civil factors and relevance. And in those 4 blocks, there are basically 4 activities, if you will, we have 4 matrices. One that we use to describe that physical environment and infrastructure. Another one where we describe the cultural factors. The third one, we describe the individuals and groups, which we call stakeholder analysis. And then the fourth one, we describe stability dynamics, where we do an analysis on instability and stability factors. So some of the activities that we do, we do an area evaluation for the physical environment. We apply the 5 dimensions of operational culture to help us describe those cultural factors. We do network assessments to be able to describe individuals and groups for our stakeholder analysis. And then we do a limited or complete stability assessment framework to be able to describe those stability dynamics. So after we do those activities, they allow us to then create the following outputs or products, such as, a civilian MACU, which is that combined obstacle overlay, a civil graphic and narrative, which we'll get to here. That's the product of step 4 of the civil preparation battle space. Operational culture matrices. So we have very specific matrices that are going to summarize all this. A stakeholder map, a matrix, and then we also have clearly identified grievances and resiliencies in that civil environment. Next slide, please. Then, all right, so the physical environment. How do we analyze this? So we use a tool. It's a matrix. Quite frankly, it's just a matrix. It's nothing really high tech, but it's a civil factors and relevance matrix, where you take one civil consideration. For example, right here we took the civil consideration of area, and then we pulled out the operational variables for area, right? And then for factors, we ask ourselves, so what are the factors in the civil environment that will significantly affect forces? And then you list out, based on initial information that you gathered, what those are. So for like area political, it could be the political boundaries. For area military, those military districts that overlap economic regions, et cetera, right? So as you see on the bottom of that chart, the factors are directly pulled from your ASCOPE PMESII matrix that you did in step 1. And then the thinking in the initial analysis goes in that relevance column, where you ask yourself, how will each factor affect the friendly forces, right? And this is where, based on reading and everything that you've done, then you make these conclusions where you say, boundaries are drawn to favor one political faction or another, if that's your finding, et cetera. So that's where you start to see those initial outputs of analysis. And this is specifically a tool to help you with that physical environment and infrastructure analysis. Next slide, please. Then we go to cultural factors analysis. We're taking abstract and intangible concepts of culture and determining the nature and scope of its impact. We're defining culture as a shared worldview and social structures of a group of people that influences a person's group's actions and choices. Civil Marines, they apply cultural perspective, taking a cultural interpretation to the information gathered. Cultural factors can also be key influences, since we know that key influences can be people, places, things. And then going back to the bias question, this is where we start to be honest with ourselves, and we try and minimize our tendency to mirror, where you look at a culture and you have to be honest with yourself. Are you looking at this culture like you're looking at your own? And you try and keep yourself from doing that, and try and look at the culture from a different perspective that is not yours. Next slide, please. So then we move on to the other technique of analysis called stakeholder analysis. There's no hard way, meaning no correct way to analyze stakeholder analysis and their abilities to influence friendly operations. But stakeholders, they're individuals and groups, and they can emerge throughout time. It's not a set thing, and they can also change sides. You could assess them to think one way, and then over time and based on that environment changing, it could completely change. Additionally, our actions can have a negative unintended effect on those stakeholders. And then once again, it's significant to know that they may result to also be key influences. Next slide, please. So then we go into this last part of analysis in step 2, where we look at the stability dynamics. We're specifically looking at instability and stability dynamics within that civil operating environment. When we talk about instability, we want to know, is there a decrease in support for the government, for that legitimate governance institution? Is there an increase in support for malign actors by the civilian population? Is there disruption to the normal functioning of the society? Those are examples of possible instability within an area. When we talk about stability, you could say it's almost a complete opposite. So is there an increase? The assumption is if there's support for that government, then that will create more stability. Is that the case in that country? Does it actually create stability? Or is there a decrease in the support of malign actors, and therefore does that increase stability? Along with increased societal and institutional capacity and capabilities. Does an increase in that result in stability? Are those things that are seen as stability factors in that area? Next slide, please. So then here we go, and we have a sample of the matrices. These are two separate matrices. They're actually separated by one on the top and then the other one on the bottom. So grievances is one of the matrix, and then resiliences. And for grievances, we're specifically wanting to know, what are those core grievances, specifically the issues and societal vulnerabilities identified in the civil considerations. So, potential situations. So if you look under events to the right, potential situations that could contribute to an increase in stability, you pull that directly from ASCOPE PMESII. And then the next column over, key influences, your means and motivations, you answer the question, what are the influences, the means and motivations that contribute to the increase of instability? And once again, you can pull that information also from your ASCOPE PMESII matrix. And then resiliencies are the complete opposite. So, what are the good things that are make this, civil environment strong or recover? So what processes, relationships, or institutions enable the society to function normally and peacefully? Are there any previous resiliencies that have been or are being undermined? You pull that from perception data, just like you did when you were noting your grievances. And then you use ASCOPE PMESII once again to determine the events and those key influences, means, and motivations for your resiliencies. Next slide, please. So here we have our source of instability analysis matrix. And we're just showing you here, what that looks like as you continue to do your analysis in a rather structured and organized manner, listing the potential sources of instability. Then you move on to find out if instability criteria is met. So, for example, does this issue decrease support for the government? Does this issue increase the support for malign actors? And does this issue disrupt the normal functions of society? And for each one of them, it's a yes or no question, and then you explain. So then you move on and you determine, okay, so is this a source of instability? Does this issue meet any of the instability criteria? And then, if the issue meets the criteria, it may be considered, it is actually considered and labeled as a source of instability. And then you move on to the farthest column on the right, prioritization, right? So is the source of instability a priority grievance for the local populace? So for this issue, for those issues that are sources of instability, you prioritize them based on whether that source of instability is also a priority grievance for the populace. So you compare it to the grievances that you initially noted in your previous matrix. Next slide, please. And then here is the source of stability analysis matrix, which is the same thing, but talking about stability instead of instability. And then we associate the sources of stability with regards to their impacts to the mission, and that is that military mission. Because we want to know whether the sources of stability are needed for mission success and whether we need to reinforce them. Next slide, please. All right, so as you could see, that was a lot of information, and that was just step 2, but that's because step 2 is the busiest one. Most of your time is done during that analysis phase of the civil preparation of the battle space. So once you're done with that analysis, you can then start doing some sort of products and kind of synchronize the information with step 3, where we develop a civil environment model. And in this step, you evaluate that civil component and produce what here in the Marine Corps we call a civil environment model, which is very similar to a technique used, and you see it as one of the products in the information or the intelligence preparation of battle space, which is that modified combined obstacle overlay. Or as us military types here, when we make an acronym, we give it a word, we call it a MCOO, MCOO, MCOO. So, a civil environment model, specifically, it depicts a system of key influences. It includes a narrative, which describes the environment that is specific to the area of operations. It provides a list of key influences produced for analytical methods such as stakeholder and geospatial analysis. And then it gives that civil picture or an actual graphic of the key influences. And it is basically a refined and pretty looking civil factors and relevance matrix. It's just another way of visualizing it. Next slide, please. And then here you have a model or an example of a civil environment model. So you have the civil environment model for the country of Utopia, where, as we discussed, starting on the left top, we have that civil environment that defines those key influences and those key society. Sorry, I can't read that. But yeah, you have your key influences in the civil environment. Then underneath that, we have our social norms, and we list those, such as our customs, our practices. Because I am in the military, then we have to associate it with our military mission. MAGTF is, the Marine Air Ground Task Force. So we have our mission there to remind us what we're there to do so that we continue to see things from a military perspective. And then we just continue to put on one slide in a place where we can easily visualize all this other factors from our analysis in step 2, so our key influences and such. Next slide, please. Then we move on to step 4, the last step. And this is the one where we, based on our analysis and the way that we model the environment, we determine that civil action. Civil Affairs Marines and those CMO planners, they develop an initial assessment of possible civil actions. Obviously, you don't know for sure what's going to happen. Based on your analysis, you can come up with a good assessment. And then you do this in particular in that area where your military forces have battle space. This assessment is further refined with that green cell on a military staff, and it can also be used in the COA wargaming process of the military planning process. So as you can see, like this output of this process right here is discussing civil action. It most definitely informs the intelligence side of the house. It can inform the IPB process, and it also can inform the operational planning process. Civil actions, they serve to paint a more complete picture of the operating environment focused on the Indigenous people and their leadership, IOs and NGOs, and then the other stakeholders in that area that military folks are going to. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a civil action. We call it a civil graphic narrative. And just like the intelligence preparation of the battle space has a product that shows the enemy most likely and most dangerous course of action, we have the civilian most likely course of action or most disruptive course of action, and that's disruption to military operations. So the thing to be noted here is once you start aggregating this with military information, your classification on this document will most probably go up, so then it could limit the dissemination to other non-military organizations. But this is a very good way to just show everything, the military operation, the initial analysis that you did on the civil environment, what does it look like on the map of where we're going. Next slide, please. All right, well, that is civil preparation